What is your next book going to be about, and why are you writing it?
Well, my career has been going back 65 years. I've been doing a lot of things from policy to lecturing, of course, research and so forth. So I've learned some things over those 65 years. And there's some key things that I want to include that describes for me better this whole idea of how food is related to nutrition.
Are the conclusions you came to when you published your book, The China Study, still the same today? Has there been research since then that has changed your mind?
Well, the first version was published in 2005, and then there was a second expanded, so-called expanded one in 2016. They're virtually the same, except there was another new chapter in there, and my son, Tom, also added something too. But it's basically the same, yeah.
If nutrition is the most effective medicine, why isn't it taught in medical schools?
Well, that's the topic of my lecture today. Basically, medicine is what I call a reductionist approach to health, looking at details, individual diseases, individual things in food and so forth. Instead, nutrition is a so-called holist disease. That's W-H-O-L-I-S-T, where we're looking at things much more comprehensively and things working together. It's a fantastic thing. That concept of holism does not lend itself to commercial exploitation. That's the problem. So nutrition is not in medical schools. In fact, there's not even a single medical specialty of 130 medical specialties that's actually dedicated to nutrition. So nutrition is excluded from the conversation.
Are there studies that prove that animal protein is a cause of cancer?
Well, that was the centerpiece of my research early in my career. I was on the opposite side of the fence, basically thinking that animal protein is the best of the best nutrients. And what I learned early on was that, experimentally at least, animal protein actually increases cancer development rather dramatically. Later on in the career, there were lots of studies came out, usually under different names, showing that if you correlate food consumption with disease outcome like cancer, heart disease, and so forth, it's a straight line relationship. So yes, from multiple perspectives, essentially, animal protein is a problem. Not specifically because of the protein itself, but because the effect it has on the rest of the diet.
In Chapter 3 of the China Study, what did you mean by turning off cancer?
Well, we learned experimentally that cancer starts with a genetic modification. We call it a mutation. Many people think that's the cause, end of story. But mutations don't reverse, we know that biologically. And what we found was that starting out with a mutation and then change the level of animal protein, we could turn on cancer growth or turn it off. Very dramatic.
Did the money you got to do your studies come from industry or government? And does that matter?
It matters greatly, but we were funded generously for many years. 100% of the money I got was from the American taxpayer, for whom I'm very grateful. Nothing came from industry.
From your early studies in the Philippines and on animals, did you learn what the mechanism was for high protein food increased cancer?
We set out on that course trying to understand what was the mechanism. That went on for about at least 10 to 12 years with a number of different graduate students, for example, each one of them working on a possible mechanism. And I learned that there's no such thing as the mechanism. That's the ground for development of drugs. What we found was instead of one operating, all host of them all work together in really a grand way. It was really impressive.
In Chapter 13 of the China Study, what did you mean by science, the dark side?
Well, I've, of course, been in science for all these years, very much from the policy level to the laboratory and so forth, and a lot of so-called expert panels as well. That perspective, from bottom to the top, essentially, I learned something that I didn't know in the beginning. Science is largely controlled by industry. Not quite so simply as I just said it. In reality, we have national guidelines, we have national advisories put up by the government. But in those efforts to make those kind of statements for the public, industry is behind the game, partly because we have the best government that money can buy. And Citizens United, I should add this here, a Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court enabled the private sector to pour into money into political races. That was a disaster. And that's really what I'm talking about. So yes, it comes out under the government label, this kind of information, but in reality, the corporate sector is very much behind it. Science, unfortunately, good people, wonderful people, they're my colleagues. We can't necessarily do all the research we'd like to do. Get the funding for it if we're going to do something that's in conflict with what I just said, with conflict of their interest.
We have 28 national institutes of health agencies. Of those 28 institutes, we don't have a single one called the Institute of Nutrition. Why is this?
Same story. Nutrition has never been accepted throughout the last century and a half. That's part of my new book, by the way, is the history of this. We've never had nutrition as a science, as a medical science accepted, either in medical schools or in doing research at NIH, which provides most of the funding. We have 28 institutes. I think it's 27 now, but in any case, we have that number of institutes, each one of them dedicated to something like heart disease, cancer, obesity, aging, so forth. We don't have one. It's called the Institute of Nutrition. And the paradigm within which we live that prevents nutrition from being taught in the medical schools is the same as the fact that it's left out of the research effort as well.
In chapter 17 of the China study, what did you mean by big medicine? Whose health are they protecting?
Well, big medicine, like big agriculture, but let's talk about medicine for the moment. Big medicine is basically for the purpose of developing drugs to sell. It's a money-making machine, it's really what it is. And the idea there is that if we get sick or we have some difficulty of some sort, that somehow, if we knew what the mechanism is, we can develop a chemical called a drug to deal with it. That doesn't work very well at all. And so as a result, big medicine is, again, operates under the premise that the best way to treat disease is with a drug. That's where all the money is. And so as a result, not only of that fact, but also because the physicians and researchers who are thinking about how to treat disease, they're not taught nutrition. So they're standing in isolation. So I question that. Because those drugs that we're taking, we have the highest drug users in the world per capita, number one. We spend the most money, number one. Yet we stand 44th in the world in terms of life expectancy. 44th. We're not getting our money's worth.
Chapter 10 of the China study was called, What are the Wide-Ranging Effects? Bone, Kidney, Eye, and Brain Diseases. What was that chapter about?
Well, that was intended to show that this effect of the whole food plant-based diet, if you will, it was intended to show that that idea is not targeted to one disease. That idea is very broad. It's nature itself. And so when it's operating to, let's say, resolve disease problems here, it operates there too. So there's a broad range of diseases that, for which there incidentally is pretty good evidence in the literature on a lot of these. So it's not targeted to one disease at a time, it's a broad range of diseases.
Do we need dairy products to have strong bones?
No, we do not need dairy to have strong bones. That was said for many years again by the dairy industry for obvious reasons. But in reality, when we compare the amount of calcium consumption, which mostly comes from dairy, we compare the amount of calcium consumption against, let's say, bone fracture rates, which is an indication of osteoporosis. The higher the calcium intake, the higher the bone fracture rate. Very, very dramatic.
In the China study, Chapter 8, Common Cancers, Breast, Prostate, Large Bowel, Colon, and Rectal. Tell us more about that.
Well, those in Chapter 8, I think it was, if I recall, we were mostly talking about reproductive cancers, breast cancer, uterine, prostate cancer in the case of men. It's really interesting. And I don't know how to explain this, but it is more than a passing interest. When we consume dairy, which comes from a reproductive organ of the cow, when we consume it, lo and behold, we learn that we start having cancers of our reproductive tracts too. Now, is that coincidence? Maybe. I don't know. I don't think so. Something really kind of, I don't have the answer to that, but that's really what happens.
Why isn't nutrition taught more in med school, and how much is taught in med school?
Well, nutrition is not taught in medical schools. Not one medical school in the United States teaches nutrition. Oh, yes, they have some lectures, and a couple of them have maybe 10 or 15 lectures possibly, but it's the old model. It's not the kind of nutrition that I'm talking about. And in reality, those short courses, if you will, that appear occasionally in medical schools, they're usually elective. You don't even have to take them. So nutrition is just simply not offered professionally.
In Chapter 16 of the China study, what did you mean by government? Is it for the people?
Well, I spoke to that, of course, before, but the government is, in fact, since 2010 especially, government is represented by politicians that have been bought and paid for because of the circulation of money in the system. We know that today in spades. And so they're beholden to their supporters. So I'm really deeply, I feel very deeply about this, that we don't have the government that we deserve to have. We don't have the government that once we did have, especially after what's been happening here in the last year or so.
In Chapter 14 of the China study, what did you mean by scientific reductionism?
Well, nature has it that our bodies and the millions and zillions of different kind of reactions and stuff that goes on, all of that's working kind of nicely together, which I call holism, with a W. Basically, I call it holism. Everything's working together. It's marvelous just to realize that this is the way it works. It seems like something in there knows what it's doing. They don't work, these things events don't tend to work against each other, they work together. That's holism. Reductionism, in contrast, is this presumption, very simple-minded presumption, that we could go in and we can find one thing, oh, that's what causes this or that. And we can find a chemical, develop it into a drug. Oh no, we're going to take care of our problems that way. That's reductionism. In reality, nature is a holistic phenomenon.
You say the whole food plant-based diet creates more health than all the pills and procedures combined. Is this just an opinion, or is it based on science?
Well, it's based on science to the extent that we can do that. I mean, obviously, you'd have to do a really exhaustive survey, if you will, but I say that primarily because when we use the whole food plant-based diet, it has remarkable effects on reversing heart disease, for example. You know, at least 90% or 95% according to what Dr. Essel and Dr. Ornish and others have done. My son, who's a physician, the co-author of the book, now is the medical director of a research program at a major medical center now. And he just published a paper just recently on one of the most costly diseases, namely chronic kidney disease. 40 million, 45 million people have that problem, and they eventually go to dialysis. It's a very costly disease, very serious. And it turns out that he actually is now doing research, and he just published this in the British Medical Journal, how he can take a 69-year-old man with diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and stage 3 chronic kidney disease. He just followed him for 4.5 months. The man ate what he told him to eat, and the results were spectacular.
You say that only 9% of university professors are on tenure and can't get fired. Why does this matter whether professors are on tenure or just a paid employee?
That's one of my pet topics these days. I was able to say and do the things I did because I had tenure. I had academic freedom. I experienced a lot of problems along the way, but still, they could not fire me. They tried, but my feeling is he's supposed to tell the truth. And in my case, it was, in the beginning, it was a challenge because I'm believing this and I learned this. So you kind of have to stick with it. And the only way that I could have operated is having academic freedom. I got tenure when I was in my 30s, which is quite young. And so I had almost all my career being able to say and do what I wanted. Unfortunately, the academic freedom now, or tenure, if you will, has been declining substantially ever since the days of Nixon's administration. It's been going down. And today, in 2010, this is already now 10 years ago, if you will. That's the latest data. Only 9% of the faculty in this country have a full professorship and tenure. I'm one of the 9%. Now it's probably 5% or 2%. It's really tragic. And I get really exercised about this because when you're talking about a democracy, where everybody has an opportunity to learn, and in the scientific community, the academic community, if we take away the opportunity of free speech, a democracy, the number one amendment is freedom of speech. And if we can't practice freedom of speech in academic institutions, we have a serious problem.
Please explain what you mean when you say, nowhere in the world of health is the gap in knowledge so impressive for some observers, yet so rejected by others as the whole food plant-based diet.
Well, the whole food plant-based diet, for a variety of reasons, works very effectively. I mean, it virtually almost completely reverses a lot of serious diseases, a broad array of diseases. And so from that perspective, I'm talking about a whole variety of illnesses and diseases, of course, being involved. That's one statement to make. The other statement is we now know, at least I believe we know, that the science is just overwhelmingly impressive. Nobody will come along and show that the opposite is true. There are some people, low-carb people, who try to pretend that. It's not true. They might get some apparent benefits, let's say in the short term, but it doesn't last. It doesn't last because the low-carb thing is a high-protein diet, high-fat, high-protein diet. And if you compare people over the lifetime, consuming how much protein, if you will, as it goes up in consumption, so does all these diseases. That's just one group who'd like to refute, what I'm saying. They're wrong, flat out wrong. And in fact, they're doing great damage to the public.
Tell us about your first study with animals, where the ones given 20% protein got cancer and the ones that got 5% got none. Were you and everyone else surprised by the result? How many times did you repeat the study after the first time you noticed the result? And what were the results when you repeated the study?
Well, first off, I got an idea that the effect of protein on cancer development was significant. That idea came from one study done in India at the time. I was in the Philippines. They didn't believe their own research, by the way, and they went and did it another way to sort of give the appearance it was different. But nonetheless, they had done that. I saw that paper. And then in the Philippines, I was coordinating a nationwide program of feeding malnourished children, where we were supposed to give more and more protein if we go forward. So, I was troubled. If protein causes an increase in cancer, as shown there, even though they didn't believe it, our responsibility is to increase protein consumption of these children. Something amiss. That really started my work and my career. So I came home and got an NIH grant that lasted for 27 years, actually. And so first thing I wanted to do was to see, is there any truth to that? Do you feed animals higher protein? That meant animal-based protein, by the way. If you do that, what happens to the cancer growth? So, well, we demonstrated in spades that the effect is measured. We did that many times. We did it, I one time tried to estimate, I think we did that study about 25 times in different ways over the period of 27 years. I have no doubt about that.
So are you saying that animal proteins increase cancer, but whole food plant proteins don't? And why do you make that claim?
Well, animal protein itself, when we tested it just alone, if you will, in the context of a total diet, we saw the effects that we saw. But going beyond that and asking questions, how does that really apply in reality with people? It turns out that because of our cultish belief in animal protein, and I do call it a cult, the more we tend to always want to make sure we get enough protein, animal protein basically. When we make that decision consciously or unconsciously, it's just the way it is, we consume more animal protein, we consume food that has animal protein in it. That's obviously animal-based food. When we do that, we decrease the consumption of the foods that matter. So we get this here trade-off. So all these effects of an animal-based protein diet is not due to the animal protein itself altogether. It has its own effects, and they're not good. But it's a combination of the other things that are being changed too, just because we want to consume animal protein.
In chapter 15 of the China study, what did you mean by the science of industry?
Well, industry, they don't practice science. I make a distinction between science and technology. I would say that 95% of the information we get in the media and so forth, it's often called science, it's also called scientific evidence. I disagree with that. Most of the so-called science that we refer to is actually being undertaken to prove a point. And so we start out not necessarily with a hypothesis, not knowing what the answer might be. Rather, we start out with an experiment when we want to prove something. Maybe it's something in our heads, we're just personally in favor of. But oftentimes it's going along with the crowd. That's not science, that's technology. Science to me is seeing something, I call it the art of observation. You see something, you don't know what to make of it. Well, you go in the laboratory, if you will, and you design studies, being totally open to whatever the results may be. I had to be that way, in my case, because I was coming from over there and seeing these results, you're faced with the proposition. Do I ignore that or, that kind of thing. But science, the theory of science, I love the theory of science because it means looking at things objectively and then getting the results and submitting them for review by peers. If you're wrong, you're wrong. Go back and do it again. That give and take like that, that's science. And so that doesn't happen in industry. They want to make something. Maybe want to make a new pill. So they find everything that they can find in the literature to support their personal or professional interests.
Is the cause of heart disease dietary cholesterol or animal protein?
It was shown back in 1909, first time. Then again, between 1909 and 1923, for example, a number of different research groups had been doing research on that question. They were noticing in those days, that's over 100 years ago, they were noticing in experimental animals, for example, that cholesterol in the blood was sort of related to the risk of heart disease. Cholesterol related to heart disease. It was natural for them to assume, the cholesterol goes up in the blood because they consume more cholesterol. So that was the number one hypothesis, if you will. But in 1909, the first person to start doing this found out, maybe not so. Animal protein was more prominent in dietary cholesterol. And then over the next 15 years, a number of different groups got involved. And finally, in 1923 and 1926 again, a group summarized, a research group summarized all that information. It said that basically animal protein unequivocally was the cause of cholesterol going up in the blood, not the cholesterol itself. That was ignored all the years since. So you have people talking about the amount of cholesterol we should consume, that's really what's causing heart disease. No, it's not. Cholesterol only comes from animal foods, of course, but that's the wrong way to look at it. That has caused a lot of mischief, because if we assume that cholesterol is the cause of heart disease, what do? We try to make some drug to block the synthesis of cholesterol. That's statins. See how that kind of reasoning really leads to some disastrous common practices.
Is cancer a genetic disease?
No. If you look at all the literature and all the stuff that the cancer organizations put out, like the National Cancer Institute, who funded most of my research, the American Cancer Society and so forth, they all maintain this, in my view, myth that cancer is a genetic disease, which means to say that if we have the genes, to cause cancer, we're going to get it sometime, because of all kinds of those. What we showed early on, it's not the genes. Yes, they're there to start to kick it off. It's kind of like the match, okay? But it starts it off. But its growth is controlled by nutrition. So it's a nutritional disease, not a genetic disease.
Are the government and USDA dietary guidelines based on good science? And if not, why?
No, it's not really based on the best of science. And I don't mean to say that and question, the scientists who are given their time, and they're not paid for this, who get together and study this question. They do. But they're kind of channeled. They're thinking, in science, we're kind of channeled to believe in certain things. If we say something different, we might get in some difficulty. In the case of the dietary guidelines, for example, that's run by a committee who meet together for 2 or 3 or 4 years or so, pull all the information together, and they do this every 5 years, what they think science is saying. If it's the same as what had been said 5 years ago or so forth, they're working away and get all the information. Then at that particular point in time, it's submitted for public review, at least in the more recent times, for some commentary. But at the end of the day, that report that the scientists worked on has to be approved by the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Health and Human Services. They have the final say. That's a political decision.
What is your online course about, and how does someone take it?
Our online course called nutritionstudies.org, as far as the linkage is concerned. That was a course I was teaching on campus for a while, for a few years, and that's another story. Eventually, it was pulled from the catalog. The guy who did that was the most influential consultant for the dairy industry in the world. He was my supervisor, right? And his successor, they did the same thing. That was a big issue, and I write about it. But in any case, they pulled it out of the catalog. But a bunch of the students I had been teaching liked my course. It was quite popular. There were somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 students who then organized a petition to have it reinstated. They did not succeed. So I said, okay, I'm going to take the course. I'm going to put it in this new online program that was emerging at the university. And so I took it here and put it there. And it's been now taught online in that program for, 7, 8 years or something like that. I think we've got about 30,000 graduates with certificates. And I'm teaching it as I see it, not as they see it, because it wasn't, as I say, it wasn't allowed. That caused me a lot of problems. Even today, I will say this on the camera, that I wrote the book, The China Study. I basically am explaining what I believe nutrition is, not according to what the system says it is. That then, in turn, the book, the university does not list it. The book that I published, I think, is maybe the most published book in the history of Cornell. Carl Sagan and I were the size of our communications, so the communication department says we were sort of equal. He was getting about the same attention I was. But in any case, my book is not now listed by the university. They don't want to have anything to do with it. yet on the outside, we've sold over 3 million copies. And that book has been translated into more than 50 foreign languages. That's a world record. That's more than Dr. Atkins had many years ago. So the book is around, it's getting all over the place. But the university wants to pretend it doesn't exist.
Do you recommend people with high cholesterol take statin drugs?
I don't want to be too firm on that. This is in part a medical decision, and I don't want to interfere in the relationship between the doctor and the patient. And it's not my game, and I'm not allowed to do that anyhow. I say that, but in reality, I wouldn't do it. I had an opportunity once I was told, because it tends to run higher in my family than otherwise, and I refused to do it. So I just can only tell what I choose to think. And statin drugs, looking at large bodies of data, they tend to reduce deaths by maybe at the best 9% over some period of time, because they're blocking cholesterol. They're doing some other things too. I think that number's high. There's others say it has no effect. And statins cause side effects. So here we are relying on statin drugs in an $85 or $90 million a year business, $1 billion business. And we can take care of that problem very easily. Why are we taking statin drugs?
Chapter 9 of the China study was called, "What are autoimmune diseases?" Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, the autoimmune disease concept, and there's 70 to 80 different kinds of so-called autoimmune diseases. It really has to do with the fact that the body is reacting in such a way that it tends to attack itself. And that's usually caused by an immune response. You consume something, the body makes antibodies against those antigens. They make antibodies. And the antibodies are usually very specific, where they kind of hit things. And then they tend to find something in our bodies, that will start attacking our own tissues. That's what the autoimmune response is really all about. That's usually triggered. That's oftentimes triggered by food.
So what diseases does a whole food, plant-based diet prevent, suspend, and or cure?
The number I don't know. All I know is some of the big ones like heart disease, cancers of various kinds and so forth. We've had some respectable research done, it's quite clear. But I've given a lot of lectures in the last 20 years, public lectures, and a lot of them in medical schools. And the number of people who come up to me after the lecture and tell me about some problem that was resolved is now well over, usually with tears in their eyes. I mean, these are really very personal stories. People saying, I did this, and here's what I got. I mean, I just had 2 people here already this morning. One was a Gulf War veteran who had some really serious problems. And I just heard about that just before coming here in this room. I hear that a lot. And so looking at the science, as I like to do, on that perspective, not being the person to treat those, but just look at that. The breadth of effect is incredible. It's like, okay, we're going to be sick or we're going to be well. And we can be sick in all kinds of ways, all the way from our sort of cognitive, mental state to our physical body.
You say that we need to get out of the business of talking about individual nutrients, whether we're talking about dietary recommendations or whether we're talking about the amount of nutrients on the side of a food box package. Please explain why you say this and why you wrote a book called Whole on this topic.
Well, thinking about single nutrients, as I've already said a few times, single nutrients, yes, they can have effects if we test them very carefully. We can maybe see their effects, and they're significant. We can repeat it, that sort of thing. The problem is when whatever we see, good or bad, in the form of a single pill, many times is not the same as we see it when it's consumed as whole foods. Of course, in the presence of whole foods, there's other things going on too. That's part of the holism metabolism concept. So a single nutrient may have an effect here when it's all standing alone. The light is shining right on that one nutrient. And it might do things exactly the opposite of what we may have thought. But when it's in the whole food and everything working together. It's one of the really impressive perspectives on the concept of holism.
Please explain further what you mean when you say cancer starts with a mutation. Some chemical comes in and changes the DNA of the normal cell and converts it to a cancer cell.
Well, we mentioned this before, but in any case, cancer starts with a gene. That's basically a mutated gene. So a chemical comes in, zaps the DNA. We did some of that work ourselves. It causes that cell to change its gene structure. So now, if that cell, our bodies repair all that stuff, 99% or more of that. It's going on all the time. But if the cell divides with that little aberration, sometimes it gets entrapped in the new population of cells. Now we've got a cancer cell with a genetic imprint that can lead to cancer. That's what I'm saying. We all have some cells in our body that can probably give rise to cancer because of genes. The genes have been altered. But the real question is not whether we have or don't have those kind of gene mutations. It's rather what do we do by way of fertilizing, feeding those things. And that's where food comes into play.
Can you summarize everything we've talked about here today in 15 seconds?
Yes. Eat whole food, plant-based food. Do not eat food that has animal protein in it. Exactly the opposite of what I thought at the beginning. It's not just because the animal protein is in it. That's not 15 seconds, but just I have two things in mind. Avoid, if possible, animal-based foods, number one. Number two, eat those foods kind of intact. We can cut them, dice them, and we can cook, and we can do all that kind of stuff. It doesn't make that much difference, just as long as we're eating all the content in that food at the same time. That's what the body wants to look at. Two things. Do not, try to avoid food with animal protein in it. Not just because of protein, but that's the way it is. Eat the food whole. That sort of also says using oil or sugar, that's not a whole food. That's where that story comes in.
What is it about the Real Truth About Health conference that made you want to come here and speak?
I was here before, as you know. I think the real truth about health, I mean, that's a good concept. That's what I like it. That's it. You're going to hear all kinds of opinions I don't subscribe to, quite frankly, a lot, but I like the concept. I like the concept. I like the fact that it's an attempt to get out to the public. I'm always interested in that.
For people that want to learn more about your work, where should they go?
Read the China study. Number one, read whole. Take the course, maybe. We have got quite an operational group right now. My own family is very much involved. The co-author of the China study is now a physician. He was an actor in theater, Tom. He's now in charge of a research program at a major medical center and doing kind of carrying on for what I thought. I have another son who's very much into the environment. And he's created a system of pods, like 500 pods here and abroad. That's kind of delivering the message to the public. And he also is the director of a film called Plant Pure Nation. Our daughter got her doctorate in education. She ended up then going to the Peace Corps, working in the Dominican Republic, and she has had bringing students down from universities to spend some time with her on the question concerning the relationship between food and environment. She's got a fantastic, it's a very unique kind of experience. We're just setting this up as part of our online course. She's the author of the book, The China Study Cookbook. Our daughter-in-law is the same thing. Now we've got grandchildren involved. One grandchild is in charge of that whole new dimension of food and environment in the Dominican Republic. They go there. They can see what's happening, in real live color. Another grandchild is he's the editor of he's the author of my new book, fantastic writer. And another one is a nurse well, there's 22 of us all together, spouses and so forth. We all eat this way. And right now we've got about 10 or 11 who are actively engaged in doing projects. I'm obviously, you can tell, I'm fairly passionate about this. I don't do it for money. The course that we have, I have never taken a single cent by compensation. When I was doing research, I never took any money from industry. I want to be free of that. And so whatever salary, whatever I got, I took what I got, but I never was in the business of trying to, it was never for the purpose of making money. I would like to end on my father. My father was an immigrant. He only had a couple years education. He's from Northern Ireland. He only had a couple years education. He was a farmer, as all my family were. I was the first one in my family on either my mother's or father's side to go to college. My father was so keen on me getting an education from the farm. We lived west of Washington, D.C. So keen on that when I was going into 8th grade, had 5 years to go in high school, I drove over 100 miles a day for 5 straight years to go to school in Washington, D.C. at a good school. It didn't cost money. It was public. It was a lot better than a small school in our area. So I traveled close to 90,000 miles to go to high school. At the same time, working when we had the time, milking cows and doing all that sort of thing. So I came from a background, and my father had a great reputation in the county for his integrity. So he wanted me to go to school, as my brother and others too. And so, and with his integrity, he said, well, remember, he's always saying something, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So I was very close to my dad, and so that's what I tried to do.